Another reason that it's difficult to find external corroboration from the Bible that dates back to the first few centuries AD is that early Christians would have felt like that was already done. Well, we've got 4 accounts of Jesus and they all line up. That's pretty good. They're all in circulation. We've got this one mega document of Acts that describes the early church. We've got these letters floating around that the apostles wrote. Those all account for the same stuff. They did history in a way that made sense for how people did history at their time. What they did checked out as legit history in their immediate context. So again, the early church would have felt like they had done a magnificent job of documenting what happened.
This is all completely backwards. The first church fathers, they didn't historically investigate anything, especially not Paul or the Gospels. I mean, they literally just read the Gospels and believed them without investigation. None whatsoever. The very same early church fathers that he's talking about here are the ones that just read and believed this stuff. I mean, if you go and you read Justin Martyr's apology, he has a very, the scripture says so that must mean that it's true type of attitude. And the same goes for the other early church fathers. The fact remains that the Gospels were anonymously written 40 years after the events supposedly occurred. Even then, only one Gospel can really be considered independent, and that would be Mark. But even that has an asterisk next to it because Mark was using Paul in order to generate his own Gospel. Because you see, Mark wasn't working off of eyewitness testimony. He was working off of scriptural evidence. And that's all he ever cites. Just scripture. No eyewitness testimony, no contemporary sources, or anything like that. At every single point in Mark where you find him, telling us something about Jesus or something that he did, you will see a scripture reference to it. But one very important thing to know here is that the Gospel of Mark doesn't name the author of the Gospel. The authors of the Gospel that we know now come from much later, from people like Papias, whose reliability is just, no, you can't rely on Papias to give you any kind of good information. I mean, Papias would just believe anything that was told to him, and he had no interest in actually verifying what these hearsay claims said. And Papias was writing about this stuff in the 2nd century, so there's no real way for him to know who was writing the Gospels. Now, this guy also mentioned Luke Acts. Well, I call it Luke Acts because they're one kind of work, but he mentions Acts here as being a corroborative sort of source for, the Gospels and everything. But what you have to understand here is that Luke Acts was written near the end of the 1st century, probably like in the 90s or something like that. So Luke Acts already had 2 Gospels to work off of, plus Paul. So he was definitely influenced and definitely copied both Matthew and Mark. So there's no way that Luke Acts can be corroborative as to, what happened. Also, it can't give us any kind of good historical evidence for it because there's a well-supported idea that Acts is actually historical fiction. You see a lot of Josephus in Acts because the writer of Acts used Josephus and other people like Homer even to generate the things that he's talking about in Acts. But all this comes down to that the early church wasn't documenting history. They were documenting theology. They were crafting their theology and they were establishing it. So there's no way that they could be establishing any kind of history because they simply didn't investigate it.